Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. Today's webinar will be about creating stylized character design in Clip Studio Paint presented by Jaki King. Before we begin the webinar, there are some housekeeping items that we'd like to go through. This webinar will be approximately 1 hour long. All attendees will be muted. Q&A session will be during the last 15 minutes of the webinar. Attendees can ask questions in the GoToWebinar question box right away. Due to time constraints, not all questions will be answered. The webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be shared on social media and will be sent via email to all registrants and attendees. The panelists for this webinar are Mari Quiñones, myself, Joanna Brower, and Jaki King. For those of you who connect with us for the very first time or have never heard about Clip Studio Paint, Clip Studio Paint is your all-in-one solution for stunning, ready-to-publish illustrations, comics, manga, and animations. Learn more at clipstudio.net/n and graphicsly.com. Also, we encourage you to participate actively through your Instagram stories. We'll share your Instagram stories if you tag us as #webinar, Hey It's Jaki, Graphicsly, Wacom, and Clip Studio Official. Jaki King is a freelance illustrator and designer and a Bostonian transplant in Vancouver. She's the creator of the webcomic KISMET on Hiveworks, and her work has also been featured in Quanta magazine and Sad magazine. And with that, I'll leave you with Jaki in her presentation, creating stylized character design in Clip Studio Paint. Thank you so much.
Hi, everybody. Thanks again, Mario. It's a pleasure to be here. For those of you who don't know, I'm Jaki. As Mario just said, I'm a freelance illustrator and designer. And today, I'll be showing you how I create stylized character designs using Clip Studio Paint. We'll be going over my process from concepting to finalizing a design. So everyone's process is different, but this is just the method that I've always used myself, and it's worked fairly well for me. I'll be splitting this presentation into two parts. In part one, I'll be going over my process, just sort of a talk through, and in part two, excuse me, I'll be doing a live demo of how I sort of put this process to work. So let's get into it. Before I even start trying to visualize what the character looks like, I'll usually start by figuring out the character's personality and defining some key personality traits. You know, for example, is this person, are they quiet or are they more loud? Are they practical and utilitarian, or are they more ostentatious and flamboyant, fun or serious? If you know, by picking out these character traits, you can better define how this character is going to choose to present themselves. So, you know, this is going to be evident in the way they dress and the way they carry themselves. So, for example, a no-nonsense character who's very pragmatic probably isn't going to be wearing a highly impractical outfit with a million bells and whistles on it, or, you know, I guess in this case, belts and whistles on it. But, you know, by defining a character's personality in this early stage of the concepting process, you can ensure that their style and posture are much more believable and cohesive later. So with all this in mind, the next step in the concepting process, once you've figured out what this character's personality is going to look like, what this personality is like, is to figure out what they look like. And the way I do that is by creating a pin board or a mood board with inspiration for both the visual design and personality quirks of the character. So there are many different apps or programs you can use for this. I like using Pinterest, but you can even just use like a Google Doc where you paste in images you find while browsing online. The idea is to create a cohesive visual library you can refer back to when designing the character, and also to use this as a means of brainstorming a visual identity for the character. So images that you can add to this pin board include clothing that you think suits the character's style, face claims to give yourself a point of reference for what their facial features might look like, or even just general aesthetic images that suit their vibe. It's worth noting that especially when you first start out making this mood board, the images don't need to be very coherent or thematic. At this initial stage, you're basically just trying to establish some visual points of reference that you can use to help with creating a mental image of this character. And, you know, with this being an evolving process, as you hone in on your mental image of what this character looks and acts like, you can prune things down if you notice that some of your older pins no longer fit the aesthetic you've developed over time. So to showcase this, I thought I'd put together a little pin board for a new character that I thought I'd prototype here. I wanted to create a sort of lawful good lady knight character, so you'll see lots of reference images for like a costume, some aesthetic images, and some art inspiration here. There's also an entire subcategory for face refs, and also one for formal wear, because I can never resist designing fancy clothes. So once you have a general idea of what your character's shapes, what sort of colors they like, and what their clothing style is, you can get right into sketching. So for that, we'll be hopping right back into Clip Studio. So this is the next step, which is creating some concept sketches and thumbnail images. So at this stage of the design process, I'll usually start by sketching out some really simple costume concepts for the character. This isn't necessarily where you need to go or where you need to begin with the thumbnailing process, but it's where I like to do it because I love clothes and I love fashion design. So that is what I like to start with. So at this point, I usually already have a couple ideas for what sort of costume I'm going for. And so I'll just sort of start brainstorming ideas. Usually I'll come up with a template and then I'll just scribble on some outfit designs on there. I'm not too worried about the details or even the shape language at this stage. I'm more concerned with just figuring out a costume that fits this character's style and personality. The idea here is to just very quickly brainstorm a couple of ideas that I can build off of later. And of course, there's always the off chance that you get a hole-in-one and really just nail the design on the first try. And if that happens, you are free to just skip this whole iteration process and, you know, pat yourself on the back for getting it right so quickly. But here, I thought I'd just demo some of my iteration process where I have a couple different designs and, you know, I have elements of each of these that I like that I'll then compile into one final design. So, you know, I liked the collar on this outfit here and maybe the breastplate here. I liked the greaves or the armored leggings here, but I also like the tails on these two jackets. So I'm going to combine all of these elements into one final design. So here we've got that same base, and I'll just flip over into a different brush and quickly sketch out just some general shapes. Again, we're not going for huge levels of detail here. We just want to get ideas down on paper. And so speed is preferable to detail. So here we've got the breastplate. I'm just adding those gloves I liked from earlier. Maybe, yeah, add some fingers to that to make it clear. And then I also liked the sort of military formal wear silhouette of the jacket under the breastplate, so we'll be keeping that down below. Let's give her some of those pointy greaves. This character I'm envisioning is sort of a prickly personality, and so I want to be deliberate about including lots of pointy shapes into her costume design to sort of, you know, visually cue people in that this person is not super into hugs, for example. So just draw on the pants, add those tails that we liked. I think I like the ones that are angled downward, and give her some real pointy shoes, pointy toes. Great. So as you can see here, we've already, in just a very quick time, developed sort of a very rough concept for what this character's costume might look like. So I also might repeat this process for the character's face and hair as well if I haven't, really honed in on what that looks like. I usually have a pretty good idea of what I want a character's face to resemble right at the start, but if I'm still trying to figure it out, I'll do a couple of iterative sketches. So here's an example that I've already put together. You'll see that in some of these earlier designs up top, that, her hair has straighter lines to it and has a couple more pointy edges and is just generally a bit sleeker. And that in the later designs, I sort of gravitated towards more of like a wavy, more organic forms in her hair, but that I've usually kept the, the angular cheekbones and the sort of prominent pout on her. So, as you sort of hone in on what this character looks like, you can just sort of keep all this in mind as you're designing their overall look. So the next step of the process is developing this character's shape language. So here I've, just drawn some really basic stick figures. The idea here is to keep the character's core personality traits in mind as you establish what sort of shapes you use to build their silhouette. You can construct a variety of different characters using very basic shapes as a baseline. You can see here I've used 3 different shapes on these stick figures to construct 3 very different looking characters. And you can also mix and match shapes as well. And even with these really simple forms, they look very distinct and they sort of convey different moods. Maybe one of these looks more assertive than the other. Maybe one of these looks more relaxed. It's sort of up to you to figure out how to use these basic shapes to convey a sense of this character's personality. Some loose guidelines I use when I'm thinking of these sort of shapes is that more rigid, uptight, or inflexible characters will typically have designs that include more straight lines and sharp corners, whereas characters that are more flexible, adaptable, or maybe free-spirited will have designs that include more curving lines and rounded edges. These aren't by any means hard and fast rules, but they're just sort of some very general guidelines that I keep in mind when I'm thinking of a character's silhouette. So another thing that I keep in mind when I'm sort of coming up with the silhouettes of these characters is that I like to contrast the different shapes between sets of characters within a story. So I thought I'd use some of my webcomic characters as an example here. Let's start with my characters, Sebastian and Octavia. So these 2 are characters that I initially designed to be visual foils of each other. You'll notice here that, let me make sure I'm on the right layer. Yes. You'll notice here that Sebastian is primarily composed of, hard edges, sharp corners, lots of pointy elements in his design, and also broad shapes. And then Octavia here is instead built up of, rounded, soft edges, soft, flowing shapes, but also with a couple of corners thrown in there. So this is basically just to provide lots of visual contrast when looking at these characters. Whoops. That makes them, the pair of them, more interesting to look at when they're together. Next, I thought I would show the characters Octavia and Tertia, who in the comic story are clones of each other. But even though they're effectively the same person genetically, their I wanted to showcase that they're two very different people through just their design. So you'll see here that Octavia is, once again, made up primarily of soft curving shapes and, fluid lines, whereas Tertia has lots of sharp shapes in her torso, in her hips, even pointy bits in her hair, kind of to showcase that she's more of a rigid person than Octavia. And this, I think, conveys that these two characters, despite looking very similar, have very different personalities. So now that we have all that in mind, I thought I would showcase how I put all of this together into one, sort of final demo where I show you how this all works together in practice. So once you basically have the general shape of the character and their outfit defined, you can start putting all of this to work into one single final design. For the sake of expediency and staying within the time limit, I've already pre-prepared this sketch of this new character that I can work from. I wanted this character to look a little bit stuffy, a little bit uptight, and maybe even kind of grumpy. The quintessential lawful good, but also no nonsense lady knight. You'll also notice that I kept sort of a feminine silhouette to her by giving her sort of an hourglass shape, but that I also made her look uncompromising, assertive, and sort of rigid in her stance by using lots of sharp corners, again, pointy elements to her design, even her jaws very square and set. And you'll also notice here that I've already put that costume sketch into use, where here's the breastplate that we sketched from earlier, the sort of military formal jacket. And you'll see that even though there's not a whole lot of detail in that thumbnail sketch, it provides us with enough information to sketch out this costume. And now we can start focusing on the details, like, maybe adding in a couple little straps to hold this breastplate in place, maybe some more details on the breastplate itself. This is the part where you can really go crazy with gingerbreading this whole thing. So I thought that I would give you a little demo of how I go about inking things in. This part of the process is pretty straightforward, especially if you have a well-defined sketch. You basically just go in and trace over your original sketched out lines with whatever pen you prefer. I usually like to swap between two different pens when I'm inking things in. I have one pen that I like using for inking in the face. You'll see here, it's the Real G pen. I think I also modded it to add a little bit of texture to it. And then for the rest of the body, I like using a calligraphy pen, which I really love the texture it gives. It also has a nice widening effect at certain points of the stroke. But I think the Real G pen offers me a bit more control, which I find helpful when drawing a face. So let's get right into it. I tend to draw with a pretty light hand. So especially in places where there are smaller details to be concerned with, like on a face, using this Real G pen is really useful since it has lots of control and variability in the overall line width. I'm also, for the sake of time, I'm being a little bit sloppier here than I normally would be. I usually try and be more deliberate when I'm inking, but in the interest of keeping this under 5 hours, I thought I would just sort of speed my way through this as quickly as possible. you'll notice I rotate the screen quite a lot when I'm drawing. This is to just help reduce wrist strain, so I'm not bending my wrist at all kinds of crazy angles. I do worry that this makes the viewing experience less pleasant, but hopefully this isn't too dizzying for you guys. One thing that I find really helpful about working digitally is the ability to very quickly hit the undo button. It's both a blessing and a curse, because it does mean that you end up taking quite a long time because there's the potential to get the perfect line, but it does also make it very easy to fix your mistakes. So you don't have to worry about, when you're inking something in, being super duper careful to make sure you get everything right on the first try. It's very forgiving. So now I'm going to switch over to that calligraphy pen, which I'll set to like a 20 to 25 pixel width. And you'll notice it kind of has this sort of bleed at the start, which makes for great, texture, and it just looks really great later on, but it's definitely too clunky for fine details in the face. We'll just so usually this is the point at which I start zooming out, since I try not to get too bogged down in the details. Easier said than done. I think many of us have have trouble losing sight of the forest for the trees, if you will, just because it's so easy to work at 600 times magnification and lose sight of the big picture when you're focusing in on these details. So this is the stage at which I usually start zooming out to try and combat that. So if you notice me not sticking exactly to the lines of my sketch, it's usually because I've decided, on the fly that I want to make some adjustments to it that I just decided not to do when I was first working on this. And again, that's kind of the beauty of working digitally, is that you can make these very confident, aggressive adjustments without being too worried about destroying the piece. You can just go back and hit the undo button later. And some straps to keep this breastplate in place. And if you're curious, why yes, the undo button is an essential part of my workflow. So another little tip that you can use when you're working in Clip Studio Paint is if you're drawing a character, or if you're drawing a figure that's being posed in a manner that is symmetrical, you can always speed up the process even more by using one of the symmetry rulers. and that will literally cut your drawing time in half. All right. So here we are. I really wanted to emphasize, with her cocked hip here, I really wanted to emphasize this sort of sharp, this corner. Again, keeping it with that sort of mental image of someone who is rigid and uncompromising in how they handle the world around them. And again, we have sort of a return of these pointy shapes. I should say, you don't have to be totally deliberate about every single aspect of a character's costume or their overall design, but it helps to be cognizant of what you're doing as you're working on it, to just sort of make sure that everything feels in character and everything sort of fits the right aesthetic. One particular costuming pet peeve of mine is when, for example, you have a character who is otherwise very, no nonsense and very practical and pragmatic, when you have them dressed in this absurd frilly outfit that is totally unwearable for day-to-day activities, let alone adventuring. So we've got some very pointy-toed shoes here. Once again, calling back to that, the sharpness of her overall design, but also because who doesn't love a pointy-toed shoe? All right, so for the sake of expediency, I really sped up this whole process. I usually try to be a little bit more deliberate with my line work, but this pretty much gets the idea across for you guys. That's how I work on the line art layers. This is a stage at which you can get really into the details of the costume. You can add little bits of flair to her overall design, and just sort of make it look more real, more true to their character, perhaps even bring back some of those motifs, that visual motifs you've been focusing on. So let's put together some flats for the character. One really excellent tool I found in the Clip Studio Assets website is, I don't know, it was very clear that I've clicked onto this tool. Over in my toolbar, you'll see this little ice cream shaped icon. I couldn't begin to tell you what this tool is called because I can't read Japanese, but this has really sped up my flatting process. So let me show you how it works. And of course, links to download any tools that I mention will be in the video description whenever Graphicsly finishes posting this on YouTube. So anyway, this tool allows you to set your line art layer as a reference layer and then fills in the reference layer without, so typically if you were to use a paint bucket tool and use the reference layer with the paint bucket tool, the paint bucket wouldn't fill in the lines as well. This does a solid fill of the whole thing, which really helps with making sure that there aren't any gaps in the flats, which is a pet peeve of mine that probably shouldn't be a point of pain for me as much as it is, because especially when you're zoomed out on a picture, probably few people will notice those details, but if you're a detail-oriented person, you will probably like this tool. Anyway, let me stop yammering and show you how it works. You basically outline the drawing you've made. Ta-da! It fills it in. And next we can use some clipping masks, which make it so that you can't draw beyond the border of the layer beneath it. Let me do a quick demo. So you'll see here, I'm just making broad strokes across the image, but it's not going past the base layer. But I'll take this moment to start flattening in the rest of the picture. So this tool also works in conjunction with whatever you've currently put down on the layer. So for example, if I wanted to add the flats for her complexion here, I can just sort of block this bit out, hop back into that ice cream tool, hope it doesn't fill in anything I didn't want it to, and there you go. You know, it's not always perfect. As you can see here, there's a little bit of her hair that needs to be erased, but it gets the job done much faster than if I were doing this by hand. So next we can do the flats for her hair. Let's do it very quick. And again, it makes it so easy. And then let's do her cravat. Let's make that a separate layer. The reason I like putting all these different colors on separate layers is by alpha locking them later and then you know, separating them all out. It makes it very easy to swap in different colors later on in the process. So let's do her jacket now. Let's do a blue color. And let's give that the underside of that jacket a slightly different color. Maybe we'll make it pink. And let's give her some pants. We'll make these a very light khaki. Yes, separated out that layer. So you'll see here, we've already got some very quick flats down. And again, you can always, let's see, you can always alpha lock these. And let's say I want to try a different color other than blue for the jacket. Let's make it purple. Oops, that's the wrong layer. Let's alpha lock this. Then we'll hit the fill bucket. Now she's wearing a purple jacket. So by alpha locking all these flats, you can very quickly swap in and out colors to, you know, sort of play with the color palette a little bit more. It sort of makes, I always pick the colors last. I know some people pick them first. This is just my personal preference to do this last because then I can play around more with the palette. But, you know, everyone's process is different. So another thing that I'll often do when I'm working on flats is I'll add a couple more details to the face to sort of, you know, give it a little bit more dimension and depth when I start adding in shading. So the way I add in shading is you'll notice I've put both the flats and the line art into a subgroup, and then I'll create a new layer above that, make it also a clipping mask, set it to multiply, and then I'll pick out a color, you know, I'll stick with this nice purple, and then I'll reduce the opacity to about, you know, 30–40%. And then from there, you can just sort of block on shadows without worrying about the distorting the colors underneath. And I usually like to, in the initial stages, work with a pretty big brush and just sort of block on where I think these shadows ought to go. So I will increase the size of the brush to about 50. You know, the brush size is pretty arbitrary. I just try and pick one that's nice and big and blocky. And once I block in these shading details, once I do that, I'll usually go in later and refine those big blocky shapes. So It's just a very quick and dirty version of what I would typically do. Normally, I would be zoomed in quite a lot and going over this a little bit with a little bit more detail. But the next thing I usually do is I'll do a lighting pass. Again, create a new layer, set it to be a clipping mask, and set that one to add glow. You can also set it to screen. That works well as well. I personally prefer the glow setting just because I think it looks a little bit brighter. I reduce the opacity of that layer a lot, usually to about like 15%. And then I'll go in and add in, you know, the highlights. Here, maybe here, maybe some shine to her hair, side of her nose. Make her greaves look a bit brighter. And again, you can always play with the different colors you choose, the opacity of these blending layers to sort of bring out the desired effect. But this is just sort of a very quick and simple version of what I would typically do. So, all right, now that you've got all that together, this is basically the process that I use to do all of my illustrations. Let me show you sort of a completed version of what all this looks like. So, again, for the purposes of this demo, I tried keeping things as quick and simple as possible so that we could stay within the time limit. But you'll see here the progression from sketch to line art to fully rendered image. And that basically covers my process. You know, I hope you found this overview helpful. Again, I'll have Graphicsly include links to all the tools I mentioned during this presentation in the video description whenever they post this up on YouTube. For now, I believe Mario mentioned he's been collecting some of your questions for me to answer, so I'll turn things over to him.
Yes, Jackie, exactly. And we want to thank all of the people who's connected with us live. And there are so many questions. Also, we want to thank the people who has been sharing their Instagram stories, tagging you, tagging us,
Oh, goodness.
Wacom and Clip Studio Paint. That's really nice. And we are reposting them in our Graphicsly account. So there's something that everybody loved. And if you can explain it again, because it really, it was something that many people asked. It's about the ice cream cone tool. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yes, I would love to share more about that tool. It has saved me so much time. I think it is actually one of the I think it's labeled under like functions and settings in the assets category. Again, link will be listed in the description, and I'll also post it in my stories later. But it is so great. I can't overemphasize how excellent this tool has been for speeding up the process of flatting. I don't know about anybody else. Flatting is my least favorite part of the whole process, mostly because I always found it tedious. But yeah, let me show you a little bit more. Let me figure out what layer to go to first. All right, so basically this tool, you basically select the area you want to fill in, and it fills it in for you, flush, like including the line art. So you don't get, so typically, let me explain this a little bit better. Typically what happens when you've set, for example, I may have outright removed the paint bucket tool. No, here we go. So the paint bucket tool also has a feature where you can set the reference layer. You'll see here, I don't know if you can tell over on the side where it says refer multiple, and it's referring to layers. And here I've selected the reference layer, and I've set the line art layer here, you'll see, to be the reference layer. So the paint bucket tool has a feature where you can refer to this reference layer only when you're filling things in. So, you know, this is on a blank layer. it's not on the line art layer. You'll see it's underneath the base layer. But if you get rid of the completed line art layer, you'll see there are like empty spaces here. Empty spaces here where the line art is. And that sometimes it creates like a bit of a gap when you're filling things in, and I don't personally like it. The difference is when you use this little ice cream tool, instead of, actually, let me just make a new layer. Instead of leaving out the line art, it just fills it all in. And you'll see it fills in the areas that you select. So you have to go all the way around whatever area you want to fill in to make sure that it's completely filled in. And similarly, if there are areas, if, for example, I don't want to fill in her pants here, I just sort of go around it. So as long as this line that I'm dragging across the screen intersects with that empty space, it won't fill it in, if that makes any sense. And again, you'll see here, the liner is filled in. It even fills in the liner up top. Whereas, you know, with the regular paint bucket tool, you still got the missing liner. So this tool is excellent. It really, really speeds up the flatting process. Yeah, the instructions are translated, I think, from Japanese, so it takes a little bit of finagling to get it to work, but it's great. Love it.
You love it, we love it, everybody loved it, so we hope people can also use it in their workflow. Also, here's an interesting question from Javier Madrigal. He says, your style reminds me of a mix between P.I., Grayson, and Caitlin. Do you have some arcade designs as references? What are your inspirations?
Ooh, oh, I have so many. I draw a lot of inspiration from stylistically. I really love Rose Besh. I think her handle is her handle used to be Barachan. I think it's since changed to something else. Her style is beautiful, super graphical, lots of bright saturated colors. I also love Tradmore. I don't know if he's I don't know if he removed his Twitter, but you can find his work just by Googling it. It is so beautiful. He has got the greatest line art I've ever seen. Such expressive, bendy, like smear frame style gesture. It's excellent. Love that. Also love Stephanie Pepper. Also another great, oh my God, her work is beautiful. She uses these really intense graphical lines. All of her work looks really like it's soft, but it's also highly geometric. It's so cool. Love it. Should definitely check it out. Other artists that I really like, Tegan White. She doesn't do comics so much as she does like natural, you know, almost like nature illustration. The scenes, like she draws lots of animals. They're beautiful. Love it. I'm missing so many now that I'm put on the spot. There are so many artists whose work I really, really love and admire.
Yeah, but there's definitely something that people will start looking at. Just a reminder that this webinar is being recorded. We'll upload it to our YouTube channel. So if you miss any name, you can just
That's
play
right.
and pause and Google this artist, this amazing artist. Jackie, here's a more technical question from Leah Caffrey. She's saying, what document size DPI would you recommend working with concepting sketches versus polished art pieces?
Ooh, that's a good question. I typically work in just obnoxiously huge sizes because you never know what you might want to turn into a print. I think usually at a minimum, I work on a canvas of like, at the very least, like 2000 by 2000, if not 3000 by 3000. I think 3000 by 3000 is my usual blank canvas. But it really depends on what you want to use it for. You know, if you are just looking to post something digitally, not interested in making a print, you don't have to use these crazy huge sizes. But if you are working in print, I usually find, I mean, at the very least, working at 300 DPI, having a decently large canvas will make sure that no matter what size print you want to make, it ends up looking nice and not, you know, horribly pixelated.
And here's another more technical question from Andrei Satov. It's related to symmetry rulers. Is that something that you use often in your productions?
It depends. The symmetry ruler is great, especially if you are, for example, just drawing a portrait. It really makes it easy to get that other eye just right. But I find that if I'm drawing something with lots of gesture, a little bit of asymmetry helps it look more organic and natural. So I don't use it super often when I'm drawing people. But for example, if I'm drawing like a pattern that I want to go on like a part of the costume, if I'm designing like a lace pattern, I'll definitely use the symmetry ruler.
Here's another question from Bainit Kaul. How do you decide on your color combinations?
This is a very good question. I just sort of I often will fixate. So, for example, when I was first designing this character, I really wanted her to have a blue jacket. And so I, you know, put the blue jacket in there first and then sort of built the rest of her palette based on that. But really, my process involves a lot of trial and error. You know, there was a time when I made her pants black and then I decided it looked too dark. There was a time when I tried gold armor on her, that did not look good. So it's really just sort of, for me at least, I will usually have one color in particular I want to include, and then I'll try and make the other colors in the design work with that one color, if that makes any sense. There are some people who are a lot more deliberate about it and like use the color wheel, like pick out tones that are complementary or, orthogonal to each other on the color wheel. But my process is a lot more haphazard than that. It's a lot more ad hoc.
Sorry, I was also reading. There are so many questions. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. If I'll also put a question box in my Instagram stories if there's anything else you want to ask me that I can't get to today.
Sorry, there's an ambulance on the back. Do you ever worry, Jordan Foreman, he asks, do you ever worry that while referencing something from your mood board, Pinterest, you will end up just copying the design too much?
I try not to worry about that too much, mostly because it's 2022 and, there are no perfectly original ideas anymore. But I think one way I avoid the problem of direct copying is by not looking at the reference board when I'm concepting things out. So that way you're not, even if you, glance back at it for inspiration, you're not going to directly, one for one copy any part of someone else's design. And especially if you're just sort of if you're not referencing it directly, if that makes any sense. Just sort of keeping it on the side as a general guideline instead of as a, one for one drag and drop source of inspiration. I think that helps a lot with keeping things your own as opposed to entirely based off someone else's.
Here is not a question, but Melly Draw says, also this is not a question, but thank you all for this seminar. So thank you all of the messages that you have sent in love.
Thank you guys for attending.
And here's another question from Rovan Deyev. He says, I always struggle going from list of personality traits, lore, to making a mood board and initial sketching. I have really hard time picturing the idea of what the character will look like, where I can start if I can't think of anything for this. Where can I start if I can't think of anything for the design? Surprisingly, this is a long question. Surprisingly, once I do make the design, it's smooth sailing afterward, but it's just the first step that tripped me up. Thanks.
I will say the first step when you're first getting started is definitely the hardest. So you are not alone in feeling this way. Generally speaking, if I am unsure, if I'm really stuck on what a character's outfit looks like, I will just go back to my mood board and I will pin more stuff to it. I really meant it when I said that it's a evolving process where, especially if at the outset you're not 100% sure, like you only have a very vague, fuzzy idea in your head of what this person looks like, just getting those visual points of reference really helps. So usually what'll happen is over time, the more stuff you add to the board, and the more you curate it later on, the more you can sort of identify, I really like this one image here, and let me figure out what it is about that one image that I like, and then I'll pin more images like it to my mood board. And so the more you do this, the clearer in your head what the image of this character becomes. And then the other thing that I do if I'm, stuck is I just start drawing. Usually it'll take some iteration. You draw something and you sort of have to reflect back on what you like about it, what you don't like about it, what you want to keep, what you don't want to keep. But just by putting ideas down on paper and seeing something for yourself, it really helps with visualizing the character.
And now that we're talking about the character, there's an interesting question from A.D. Smith. Do you have any tips on keeping a character consistent?
There are a couple ways to interpret this question. I am going to start with the interpretation of how do you keep the character consistent in their overall design. And for that, I just, keeping that list of key personality traits is really helpful. If you or even just having a really good developed idea of what this character's backstory is, also really helpful. As for keeping the character consistent over time as you draw them, that it really comes with practice. And also with, at least for me, I like pinning lots of face references to my pin boards, mostly because it helps with visualizing this character's facial features and keeping those consistent as you draw them in multiple different angles, multiple different lighting. Just having an idea of like, this is what their general cheekbone structure looks like, or this is what their nose looks like, or this is their eye shape. That having an actual visual point of reference really helps with that.
And Jackie, this is my question. Do you have any tips for keeping the character consistent in terms of design? If you're, for example, in a model sheet, if you want the character in another position, like rotating, profile.
So keeping the character consistent across a model sheet, so usually having those guidelines that you see on so many model sheets, for example, the ones that sort of indicate where, let me get the pen tool out again and make sure I'm on a new layer. So having those lines in place that indicate, head height and then general actual height really helps with keeping their height and size consistent, their proportions. But aside from that, I would say that having a very developed idea in your head of what their costume looks like from both the front and the back really helps with this. And sort of visualizing each different component as a three-dimensional structure as opposed to just a basic shape. So once you've got that thumbnail image, that thumbnail sketch down of what the basic shapes of that outfit looks like, you can then from there start visualizing what it looks like three-dimensionally.
And here's another question from Elizabeth Anderson. Jackie, your style is beautiful blend of cartoon and realism. How did you develop your personal style?
This is a great question. I would say that everyone has a different way of figuring out their own style, and that style is something that's acquired through both time and practice. But for me personally, my style is basically a mix of things that I like from many different artists that inspire me. I've always been really inspired by the like the really crisp black and white line art in manga style art, but I've also really enjoyed the sort of high contrast use of shadows and more realism in Western comics. So I would say that there's a healthy mix of both in my own personal style. And also, you know, I think there's a lot of hallmarks of our style that are just indications of what we personally like to draw. So I love drawing like swirling, swoopy, organic lines. So you'll see a lot of that in my work, just because I find those things really fun. Similarly, costumes. I love drawing costumes. I love designing them. So I put a lot of work into making sure they feel true to the character, but also, you know, that they're fun for me to draw. So yeah, I basically figure out what you like drawing, figure out what you like seeing in other people's art, and then just mix all those up into your own personal brand of art.
Yes, of course. And another question from Igor Markovich. What is your preferred historical period fashion you you
Oh,
default to when creating outfits? This is more like a personal taste.
oh my
Eh,
goodness. This is a
uh,
hard question to answer. There's a whole variety. I'm not the most well researched historical fashion nerd. I am just someone who loves beautiful clothing. So you know, I may be getting some of this wrong. I personally, my favorite time period for fashion is probably between like the turn of the century, 1900s and through like 1930. I feel like, especially in the 20s, that period had clothing that had lots of really cool details in them. Obviously, the Art Nouveau and Art Deco aesthetics are also so cool to look at. Love the organic shapes in Art Nouveau. Love the, you know, the really strong geometry in Art Deco. Those are my favorites, but obviously I draw lots of inspiration from other time periods. Um, I just I couldn't I don't think I could possibly name one single time period that I love over others, since I think 1900 through 1930 is actually a fairly large window. But yeah, that's probably my favorite in terms of details. But yeah, I love them all. They're so cool.
yeah, and also from Brandy Jackson. Okay, this is a very long question, but I get her point. So, say you've accepted a job to create some concept art for a character that has a general direction and background, but no previous illustration or anything from other artists. What kinds of requirement do you ask to the client, or what do you expect to receive? I've seen much
Ooh.
as a mood board, adjectives, writing prompts, etc. What has helped you to be most successful in this kind of work when it's not your own character?
Oh, this is an excellent question. So personally, when I've taken character commissions in the past, I always like to ask my client for to give me the info dump. Basically, if they have face claims, if they have, you know, outfit inspiration images that they have, even if they just have written descriptions of the character, or if they have like even better, like a character backstory, the more information, the better. I think I've said to multiple clients multiple times, there's no such thing as too much information. I want to know everything about this character, just because the more you know about a character, the more you can make their design tailor fit to them. Um, even if a client doesn't have face refs, even if they don't have like a defined outfit for the character, if they have a detailed description of like, you know, this is their D&D character, this is what they've gone through, this is the weapon that they like to wield, this is their class, that all gives you a lot of information as the artist to sort of start building your own mood board for this character. And if truly the client has 0 reference images available, before I draw anything at all, I usually put together a mood board and send it to the client and say, take a look at this, let me know what you think fits the bill and what misses the mark, and we'll go from there. And usually, depending on how much I've nailed it in that first try with the mood board, we'll do a little bit of iteration based off of that, just to make sure where both you and the client are on the same page as far as what your mental image of this character is.
Jackie, we are reaching the end of our webinar. Unfortunately, time to go, but we have 2 more questions.
Of course, ask away.
One of them is, what's your favorite Clip Studio Paint tool?
Ooh, oh, that's a good, that's a very good question. It's hard to pick one. I mean, my favorite that I use literally every time I draw anything has to be that stupid ice cream, the ice cream paint bucket tool. Great, love it. It really speeds up the flatting process. But I would say the real MVP of Clip Studio Paint in terms of my tool set is definitely the ability to use as many layers as I want, to set the ability to set clipping masks on subgroups. This is I don't know if this is too technical or if this is, you know, gibberish to people who are listening, but my art and also my comic pages is just, it's layers, layer subgroups and clipping masks all the way down. It is like 100, 200 layers and like a million clipping masks above it. Having that functionality built in is so great. Like other programs I've tried just don't have the same, they really just don't have the same level of that functionality. I think there are some that even like limit the number of layers you can use, which is a nightmare for me. But yeah, having that is super great. I mean, also the brush editor,
Awesome.
also really good.
And Jackie, one last question, just to close the webinar. What's your advice for anyone who wants to make their own character more stylized, make their own personality and its own features?
Ooh, I think the best advice I have to give for really bringing your character to life and stylizing them in a way that feels true to character is really to love that character. You know, you have to kind of be you really have to kind of fixate on them a lot in order to really want to add all these little tiny details to their design. But I guess on a more practical level, just always keeping in mind who they are, you know, why they are the way that they are, and keeping all that in mind as you're figuring out what they look like. Because truly, the way we choose to present ourselves to the world is a sort of an expression of our own personal preferences and interests. In real life, people who are very pragmatic and don't care about fashion will probably just wear, you know, whatever feels comfortable and doesn't look horrendous, they'll probably wear that. Whereas someone who's more, you know, perhaps more artistic, or someone who loves a specific color, you'll see that comes through in the way they dress and also the way they carry themselves. You know, someone who's sort of downtrodden might not sort of carry themselves with their shoulders flung back and head high, whereas someone who's much more confident and assertive will walk around with their chest puffed out. Just sort of keeping all that in mind as you're designing the character will really help make them feel more authentic.
And with those wise words, we are closing our webinar. But before we go, we want to share one last bit of information. This webinar has been recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. So please subscribe to Clip Studio Paint channel and Graphics Lead channel, so you will receive a notification once the video is available. For more information about Clip Studio Paint, visit clipstudio.net/n and graphicslead.com. And for all of you who are asking, where can I find Jaki? Well, please follow Jaki on her social media, Instagram as Hey It's Jaki, the same for Twitter, Jaki Draws on Twitch, and also her website designed by Jaki.com. And with that, we are finishing this amazing webinar. Thank you so much, Jaki.
Thank you for having me, and thank you guys for tuning in.
Yes, thank you so much for attending this webinar, and we hope to see you in our next event. So stay tuned. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.